So I wanted to play with you guys a couple of clips and just get your reactions to what he's saying here. So he's just first of all, he's kind of telling his story. He started as pretty left wing, and then he was concerned about where it was headed, and has kind of changed his philosophy. But he's going to describe a little bit more about his
But
personal story. Here we
it
go.
has some nice ideas in the left, sort of share the wealth.
Wealth is always shared. Like, that's not their idea. Like, kings used to literally give out money after looting a city to their nobles to keep the nobles happy. Like,
But did the nobles then give it to the peasants?
They've got no choice. They've got to pay the peasants for the labor. Like, otherwise they won't do it. So wealth has always circulated. Like, this isn't some sort of new innovation that the left have come up with. The left's innovation is to make it so that we all have the same wealth. They want us to all ultimately be the same. And that's actually a really evil prospect, if you think about it, because that means that someone who does no work at all is entitled to exactly what I have, exactly what you have, which is not fair.
See, I like Hanlon's razor, and maybe to the point of being naive, but I'm just sticking to it. The idea that it's not necessarily out of evil, but maybe stupidity. I mean, you said yourself you were quite left wing.
It's not even evil. It is evil, but it's not that the people are evil. It's that they think this sounds like a nice ideal.
Yes.
It's not a nice ideal, actually. It's actually the end of what they claim to be to most value, which is diversity. Diversity comes from inequality, because equality means sameness. And if we're all the same, then there is no diversity. And this is the problem with liberalism. It is a great homogenizing force that seeks to turn everything into the same thing. And they don't know when to stop.
What do we do then with the idea that there's 8 billion people on the planet, there's a whole bunch in the UK, some were born like in a bin, and I went to private school and had a nice life. And we don't want equity, because that's just ridiculous. But what do we do? Do we just go, well, that's your lot?
Well, I think that the most important thing for people is to feel that they're being treated fairly. Right? That's because as soon as we get off of ideological language like equity, equality, liberty, all this sort of stuff, and say, okay, but on the basis of how we feel about these things, am I being treated fairly? And so there was an example, I think it was in Cheshire, of a young chap who had looked his entire life to join the police force, and so he'd got the right qualifications, he'd done the right training, and they denied him on the fact that he was a white man, and he sued them successfully over that.
Brilliant.
Right?
So I want to stop this clip. There's 2 more I want to share with you guys. But his first kind of critique there, which I think is so important to say, is that I really think that it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that people to ensure justice, and that is that we all are equal before the law, and that it's not the job of the government to attempt to balance the scales, and that's not the same as justice. There's nothing justice about that. That actually is sort of a perversion of the idea of justice. Justice is when I have a dispute with somebody, and this needs to be adjudicated. Are we treated fairly? That is critical. But what's really ironic is that the government is now stepping in and committing a series of injustices against its citizens in order to ensure justice, right? Their version of justice. And so I'm curious what this, kind of gives this example of. It all comes from this idea that, okay, there's the government has a need to enforce equality or equity. And, one of his critiques there is that it actually destroys diversity. Like, you can't, if you start to do this, if you start to enforce that we're all going to have the same outcome, regardless of what we actually do, then you're going to destroy the diversity that's created by all the different things that we ought to be free to pursue, and that the government needs to stay out of that whole. That's just the realm of freedom that it needs to provide for its citizens, and the only time for the government to get involved to rectify an injustice is when there's something unfair happening between 2 parties, essentially, that need to be adjudicated. Any thoughts about, like, I think that's a really interesting description of really the problem of liberalism.
Well, I think it's wild that those are two things that they claim to uphold. Like the two of their biggest values are equality and diversity. But for him to say you cannot have diversity if you have equality, I haven't heard anyone say that, but it makes total sense. Like if everyone is the same, how can you be diverse?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the difference is the fairness. I think that was really great for him to say. You're right. He's very articulate and like he says the right things for this kind of issue. Especially when he started off with saying that wealth has always been the way that it has been. Like the rich people get it and then they pay the poor people for labor. And that's how it works. That's how it has always worked. And that's been fair, not equal. And so if you're going for equality, it's eventually going to come full circle. I've heard this criticized about the left party a lot, is that they try so hard to get a certain place only to end up right back where they started.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened with the communists, the socialists, and that's what they're trying to push now. And if they keep going down that rabbit hole, then they're going to end up right back where we started. And if you keep on pushing for equality and diversity at the same time, that's going to happen. So,
well, I always think about getting right back where we started is like, what if in 100 years they're pushing the same campaign, but for straight white people? Because
Exactly.
like, after everything they've done, it's like ended in like total discrimination of like straight white people or whatever the category you want to say. And so like in 100 years, they're fighting the exact same fight, but for the opposite group because they realize like, and it's just like a cycle. I don't know.
Right. Well, it's
mhm.
interesting when he was describing how there's something evil about this, because a lot of what people call social justice, which are the kinds of laws or movements that would be enforced by the government to ensure that people begin to experience better equality because of maybe historic problems that have occurred. I really think that that's not necessarily justice. I think that's actually kindness. I think what's difficult is that you would see why it's evil for the government to enforce kindness, because the government can't enforce kindness. And so to actually enforce justice, you have to make very clear who the aggrieved party is and who the, both sides of that, and then enforce a restitution. And I do think that there's lots of cases in which that needs to happen. And I think that that is justice. But oftentimes these very broad scale movements to say, well, there's sort of a historically disadvantaged group. And so we're going to take a historically advantaged group and just start stealing from them and give it to the like I think there is a need for kindness to those who are disadvantaged, but I don't think it's not helpful to call it justice. I think that is that actually creates an evil, which is not difficult to perceive once you use the correct language. But it's the
Yeah.
really co-opting of the word justice that confuses everybody so deeply. And I think that justice needs to be understood as equal before the law. In other words, when you stand before the law, you cannot advantage the rich or the poor, the advantaged or the disadvantaged, that you all are equal before the law, and that in that place, anyone could receive the same um, outcome based on not having anything to do with who they are intrinsically, but because of the laws of themselves are equally applied to both parties.